Hello and welcome back to the Skylark song by J.M. Frey. It's time for Chapter 10. Robin was already trussed and blindfolded, wrists bound tight behind her back, metal cuffs threaded through a metal loop bolted to the bench, when the Coyote climbed into the transport wagon. She knew it was him because the soldiers squeezed in shoulder to shoulder on either side of her, made her lean back so whoever it was could pass, which could only mean that he had to be someone important. The person rapped on the dividing wall between the back filled with benches and the driver with what sounded like the butt of his sword, and said what Robin assumed was the Clonnish word for drive or go in the Coyote's voice. Did you just leave him out there? Robin asked, throat dry, voice tight with fury. Around her, the transport wagon shivered to life as someone started to crank the engine. Silence! Another soldier snarled from right beside Robin, and she curled her shoulders inward and absolutely did not cringe. She was surrounded on every side by Klonn, literally packed in, and it would be very easy for one of them to decide to use their pistol for more than empty threats. "And what else would you have us do, my dear?" the Coyote asked, settling in directly opposite her. "The rites, the funeral." "The remains of your glider are giving off quite a lot of smoke. Your people will find your mid-flight, if they follow it." But the Coyote never leaves bodies." One of the other soldiers said something in Clonnish. The Coyote gave an inelegant snort and replied waspishly in the same language. Then he added, so she could understand, "For this one, we make an exception." "Why?" Robin choked. "Because you asked it of me." The transport's engine revved up, and the whole thing lurched. Robin had a stern stomach. You had to spend as much time in a glider as she did, but being unable to see the landscape moving around her as the transport chugged away made her head swim sickeningly. Or maybe that's the crash, she chided herself. Lots of trees to hit your head on the way down. That's the only way to explain why he's being so... But she didn't have a word for what the Coyote was being. It wasn't kind. It wasn't thoughtful. After all, she was a prisoner of war, but it also wasn't what she expected. Anticipation kept her skin pimpled, her hair standing upright, her teeth bared. And yet, what was there to anticipate? She didn't actually know. No one had hit her yet, no one had roughed her up, no one had even really pointed a weapon at her. The only person to have laid hands on her was the Coyote, and even then it wasn't to harm so much as to hold in place. The transport wasn't a large vehicle, and it reeked of the gasoline that ran it. The Coyote's knees bumped Robin's, and she drew back her legs. It jolted her ankle, and she hissed and winced at the shock of the unexpected touch that startled her. "You have made it worse," the Coyote tutted. A hand touched her left knee, and then, without warning, her calf was yanked upwards so that her boot landed on his thigh. "Why did you try to run on it?" Fingers plucked at her bootlaces. "Let me go!" Robin shrieked, wriggling against his hold. She careened into the soldiers on either side of her, trying to wrench her leg back. Fingers dug into the joint of her shoulder, the back of her knee, the insides of her elbows. "Get off!" "Be still, fool!" the Coyote snapped. One long-fingered hand curled around her heel, fingertips pressing in just enough to make Robin whimper and go still, just enough to imply the promise of more pain if she didn't cooperate. "Or they shall make you stay still." As the Coyote resumed undoing her laces, one of the soldiers said in very halting Saskwyan, "Should you really? A medic can—" "Enough!" the Coyote snapped. The soldier fell silent after a quick "Aye. Robin, equally cowed, stayed as frozen in place as possible as the sway of the transport allowed. He peeled her boot and sock away in one swift motion. Strangely, the first thing Robin worried about was how rank her feet must be after so many hours jammed inside her footwear. Of course, she was ridiculous for being worried about that in a transport crammed with sweating people in what felt like wool uniforms and reeked of black smoke and blood. The Coyote's touch was light on her ankle, warm in a way she didn't expect, even through the leather of his gloves. Robin was glad for this blindfold suddenly, for the way it covered pretty much everything from the tip of her nose to her hairline. There was something so deliberately reverent about the Coyote's touch in the dark closeness of the transport that it was very nearly intimate. "Why are you being kind to me?" Robin whispered. "Would you rather I was not, my dear?" the Coyote replied, voice equally low and soft. Beside her, the soldier who had spoken in Saskwyan, who clearly understood what she was saying, sniggered. Robin remembered where they were then and yanked her foot back. The Coyote sighed as if she was being a particularly obstinate child, but said nothing else. The rest of the journey was as silent as it could be in a rumbling, juddering transport stuffed with the enemy. Robin tried to memorize the turns, the direction she was being taken, but the truth was she'd had no idea where they'd even started from, and had no way to tell where they were headed. Klonn, obviously, she reprimanded herself, but which part? Were we south enough to be within easy distance of Lylan? The humid closeness of the truck combined with the darkness of her blindfold and the last of the adrenaline that was finally wearing off, and Robin felt herself start to nod. She scrunched her eyes, took deep breaths, tried everything to stay awake, but eventually someone shook her leg softly and said, "Wake, we do not have much time." Robin jolted back to consciousness, hips and ribs and ankle burning in pain. She kicked out with her booted foot, and it connected hard with the Coyote's shin. He grunted and shifted away. "Stop it now," he hissed. "Listen to me." "Why should I?" "Because I left your Al to be found when my general would much rather I had not. I have done him the favor of a seely burial, and so I ask a favor of you in return." Robin wasn't chastened, wasn't convinced, not really, but she was willing to listen. She shut her mouth and thrust out her chin, waiting. "You must trust me, please," the Coyote said, voice barely audible. It was only then, listening to the way it echoed off the metal walls of the covered transport, that she realized they were alone. Utterly alone. With the enemy. "Let me out," Robin hissed back. Just let me go." "I cannot." "Then get away from me." "I cannot. Please, you must trust me." There was an earnestness in his plea that Robin hadn't expected, and it threw off her panic just enough for her to think rationally about this. Was this a real, honest request? Or was this the start of some strange sort of mind game, some psychological torture? The Coyote said he took the mid-flights, that he kept them. Was this how it began? "I have no reason to trust you," Robin snarled back. "I am well aware, my dear," the Coyote said ruefully, "and yet I ask it of you all the same." "Give me one good reason." Robin said when he tried to interrupt her, her voice a dry scrape, frustration and fear balling up on the back of her parched tongue. "One that doesn't use my best friend's murder as a bargaining chip." The Coyote said nothing. He went so quiet, so still, that for a moment Robin feared he'd simply left the transport, disgusted by her demand. Tired of the game. Perhaps he even had his pistol drawn and aimed at her head right now, and she'd never... "Because," the Coyote said eventually, and Robin was so caught up in the hive of her imagination that she actually jumped up at the sound of his reply. "Because I need you to." "That's not..." Robin coughed once and swallowed, trying to work some saliva into her mouth. "Here," the Coyote murmured, and there was the welcome metallic snick and scrape of a canteen being opened. He tucked his fingers under her chin lightly, urging her to tilt her head back. Robin allowed herself to think about poison for only a second. Then the cool, clean water splashed against her lips, and Robin was so thirsty, and it was so good, that she gulped down as much of it as she could. Trickles of water escaped the corner of her mouth, and when the canteen was empty, the Coyote dabbed at her wet face and neck with what felt like an actual God-stamped hanky. Robin bit back a hysterical chuckle at the thought of the fierce Coyote in his lupine helmet, dabbing fussily at her mouth with a lace-fringed square like an old grandmother. better. Yes, but it's also not an answer. I need you to isn't good enough. The coyote put away his flask and then gently maneuvered Robin's foot back inside her sock, the boot he left off. Because, he said again, drawing out the word, because, Miss Pilot, you are not the only prisoner here. In Saskwya, thievery was punished with the forceful, bloody removal of a thumb. This was usually done on the spot by the soldier who caught the perpetrator, and with whatever sharp implement they happened to have at hand, clean or not. Robin still had both of her thumbs, despite the number of factories and burned-out homes she'd burgled, and she offered a prayer to the gods, much as she did every time she defied her parents, scavenging for glider parts and things of value in the debris, that tonight was not the night she had been caught. She flipped her house key between her fingers, tugging at it where it was attached to her undervest button with string, tapping it restlessly with her thumbnail. She was standing on the street, a few blocks from her parents' house. Al's house, yes, that's where she was. She was standing outside the Bridget family home, crammed with little children and cousins whose parents had been killed in the raids, 3 people to a bed, but no. There was no house there. It was gone. And in its place, a smoking hole, a spray of brick and bone and blood, and Robin took a step back, horrified, her boots ringing out on the heaving stones of the street. She clung to a wall as the street lamps swayed back and forth and thought, oh, omens an earthquake. We're not supposed to get earthquakes this far inland. The rollicking stopped, and Robin swung her arms around one of the iron poles as if holding it down with her body could hold the streets still. A heavy haze had settled with the dusk. The perpetual clouds of soot that blew in off the factory fields had mingled with the evening's heavy fog, obstructing her view. Red brick dust choked her lungs, and Robin coughed, hard and long. A white blur of movement caught her eye, and her heart shot up into the back of her throat, fear crystallizing on her tongue. A cat sat primly, cleaning a paw on a nearby wall, looking for all the gods as if the world hadn't just rattled around its ears. A fellow nightpad, then. And harmless. She began picking her way carefully among the rubble, keeping to a slow and careful pace that wouldn't attract the unwanted attention of the curfew constabulary. She heard the dogs in the distance, but they never got closer. With a start, she realized that nothing seemed to be any closer than it had been a moment ago. Where was she going? Home. Home? The haze shifted, and Robin caught sight of her bedroom window a block away. The ragged ends of fabric stuffed into the gaps in the board fluttered in the chill autumn breeze. They looked like ghost hands beckoning her on. Her stomach unwound slightly at the familiar sight. Relief flooded her veins, and she sighed. The cat made a noise that sounded strangely like an echo. A soft, swooshing noise plucked at her ears. Robin froze. Omens, she cursed quietly. She stepped back quickly out of the dim orange spotlight of the street lamp and put her back against a half-crumbled wall. She lowered her head so the darkness of her dirty cap hid the shine of her dusky cheeks from the sweep of a searchlight that crawled along the ground. The urge to run was strong, but she defied it, keeping still. The light swept across the heaved flags of the shattered sidewalk, climbed over a downed garden wall, over the ruined remains of someone's private beehive, and then dropped away into darkness. Robin counted to 10 to give the glider ample time to pass, tracking its tail across the sky. The cat yowled and leapt away, at least as reluctant to be caught out as Robin was. Each noise made Robin more impatient, more desperate to get out of the open, more sure that this time would be the time that the soldiers caught her. When she felt it was safe to move, she slipped forward again, and then, somehow, Robin was already inside her house. She stood in the hallway, Mama's loom hanging off her arm, a gearbox glowing orange from the forge in her other hand, but not burning her skin. Not hot. Not at all. Robin hefted her burdens and crept towards the parlor. Yes, this is where these went. She set the gearbox down on the sofa so she could place the loom on Mama's small table. The heated metal made a hard cracking sound followed by a horrific fa-whoosh as a fireball caught in the air. The thick, coating, acrid smell of smoke plowed across her tongue. "Robin!" someone called from the other side of the flames that leapt up to consume the sofa. They surrounded Robin faster than a blink. "Papa?" Robin called back. "Mama! Robin!" A silhouette appeared on the other side of the flames, dark and dancing as the sinister light shifted. Hands reached out to the fire. "Don't touch it!" Robin warned. The figure didn't stop, and the flames parted at their touch. "Papa! Mama!" Robin howled. "Help me!" But it wasn't Papa, and it wasn't Mama. It was Renge. Her mouth was pulled back in a tight, painful rictus of smugness, her teeth somehow too long, too sharp. There was a bloody knife in her hand, a thumb in her other, and it was, oh gods, it was Robin's thumb. Her teeth were growing as she advanced. They just kept growing. Her nose elongated, turned black, jaws slavering, lupine. Robin screamed, loud enough to wake herself up. Robin jerked awake and sat up, eyes wide to drink in what little light was available. Something white flashed in the corner of her eyes. The cat. But no, there was no cat. The instant she was upright, Robin moaned and curled around her midsection, one arm cupping her battered ribs. Her left ankle throbbed in time, tight and hot. Every part of her protested so strongly that Robin let herself flop back down. The nightmare faded, got fuzzy. Darkness danced at the edges of her vision, making it hard to concentrate. Her favorite scent in all the world was that of freshly cleaned cotton. She turned her head as far as she could without moving, stuffing her nose against the pillowcase, and inhaled deeply. Yes. Mama had just washed the sheets. There was fresh baked bread and honey for breakfast. There was no war. Safe, she thought for a moment, and then... No. Wait. No. Not safe. She made herself sit up again, biting back groans all the way. Never mind the pain, she scolded herself. Where are you? And how do you get out? The room was slowly coming into focus as her eyes adjusted. A slim bar of light ran along the bottom of one wall, the golden quality betraying it to be a gas lamp. Light under a door, then. Bright hallway. Not good for escaping unseen, she thought. Robin licked her lips thoughtfully and then gagged. They were sour, sort of dusty, powdered with a chemical aftertaste. Stupid, she berated herself. You should have known better than to accept a drink of water from the flask of an enemy soldier. She felt clear-headed now, though, without the overwhelming urge to sleep pressing under her skin. Whatever drug had been in her system, it must have passed. I'm lucky to be alive, she thought. The Coyote kept his word there, at least, but why? You are not the only prisoner here, he'd said. Did he mean Rez and Woden? Were they still alive? Were there pilots? Would the Coyote try to use her fellow Sealies as leverage against her to get her to do what? Exactly. She still had no rutting idea why she wasn't dead. Thinking about it wasn't going to make the answers any clearer. She was no wise woman to read and interpret dreams, so she decided to turn her attention to her predicament. Robin wiggled her toes and fingers just to prove that she could, and then moved on slowly to every other joint, working her way inward through her wrists and ankles, elbows and knees, finally her neck and shoulders and her spine. Everything seemed attached and mobile, though her left shoulder screamed when she forced it into motion, and her left ankle proved to be heavily bound in something very constricting. Her feet were bare. The most painful part of her proved to be her hips, where her safety harness had dug hard when she'd been thrown against it, and her bottom ribs. She straightened slowly, biting her lips to keep the little mules of pain suppressed and to avoid any further jolting of her abused midsection. Where's Al? Is he here? She strained her ears, but the only sounds echoing in the darkness were her own. and then she remembered. Heat pushed behind her larynx. A scream, a sob, hysterical laughter Robin didn't know. She only knew that if she made the sound, someone would know she was awake. She clamped her hand over her mouth to keep in whatever it was that was trying to escape. Her hand was shaking so badly she feared bruising her own nose, so she bit down gently on a knuckle and waited for the shivering to pass, eyes squeezed shut. Gasping filled her ears, and she realized she was the one making the small, pathetic sound, suffocating in her pain and panic. She forced herself to breathe at a normal pace, forcing her chest to unclench, and touched the back of her hand to her lips, deliberately conjuring up the memory of Al's rubbish attempt at a kiss. Robin wished she'd taken the time to say something to him that morning, instead of letting what had happened the night before get between them. Instead of the tense silence, the arrogance of assuming that they'd get out of this alive. She wished futilely that there'd been time to... Robin didn't even know what. Time to explain why not. Time to say yes. Time to at least give it a try. Now there was time for nothing. Robin clapped her palms over her eyes, determined not to sob like a child. She didn't have time for this. She needed to get out, get away, get safe. That's what Al would have wanted. Is that how I'm going to hold him in my heart now? She thought. Convince myself to do things because that's what Al would have wanted. Force him to become my god of morals and ethics. I'd rather have him here with me, alive and making bad choices and... God, just shut up, Robin. Just shut up and focus. She forced herself to suck back the grief. She mopped her face with the back of her hands and resumed casing the room. It was not, as she'd expected, a prison cell. It was a bedchamber. And a fancy one at that. Too fancy. Revoltingly fancy, really. Wastefully fancy. Now that her eyes had been accustomed to the dark, Robin saw that there were sconces ringing the room, too. They were shuttered so low that they hadn't seemed to be lit at all. It gave the place an eerie orange glow that made it hard to determine how big the room was, hiding the corners in a sort of false twilight. Robin forced her mind away from tales of spirits and malevolent gods that roamed the border between day and night. She was a soldier. If she could handle dances with Klonn airships and being shot at, she sure as hells could handle a strange, poorly lit room. She was sitting on a large and very ornate bed in what had to be a private bedchamber. She was sitting on a large and very ornate bed. There were an inordinate number of pillows, and the coverlet was made of something soft and comfortable, which immediately ruled out a hospital or field medic's tent. She tried very hard not to think about why someone would install an injured enemy soldier in a very luxurious bedchamber, and not within the presence of a medic. She didn't like the answers her slightly hysterical mind had to offer, so she forced herself to scout her surroundings instead. She swung her feet to the edge and dropped quietly onto the carpeting, and it was so rich and so lush that it hardly even whispered as she stood. The pain from her ankle radiated up her leg, and she grimaced, shifting her balance over to the other foot. Hells, she thought. No way I can run on this. But I could sneak, if I had to. Her boots were lined up neatly beside the bed, and she slipped them on. The flat knife she kept hidden in the tongue of her right boot was miraculously still inside its camouflaged leather pocket, but her more obvious boot knife, the one whose hilt stuck up out of her left boot, was gone. One blade is better than none, Robin thought. Her empty belly growled its unhappiness, and her head throbbed. Her ribs ached less, so she downgraded her earlier assessment from broken to just bruised. All the same, she knew that she was in no shape to fight her way out. Hobbling, she went to the door. It was locked, so she made a circuit of the room, counting out how many paces long each wall was, noting where there was a washstand, a vanity whose mirror was draped in black lace, a wardrobe, and windows. She threw back the curtains and stared at a dimming sunset. She'd slept through the afternoon. Maybe she'd been asleep for days. The world outside the window was nothing but a wide, rolling lawn bordered by a brilliant tapestry of autumn forest. There was no road, No creek, no landmarks to indicate location, nothing for her to recognize and match against the aerial map of the Klonn's forests in her mind. She had no clue how close or far away she might be from the bloody fingerprint. Robin pressed her cheek against the chilly glass of the window and gazed up at the sky. Sharp, hard longing welled up, and she fisted her hands in the drapery. The seam of the valance started to rip, and she forced herself to let go. The windows were heavily mullioned and crisscrossed with metal bars cemented into the casement. The cement, when Robin bent to peer at it through the thick glass, looked pale and new. Where in the hells was she, that someone had installed bars outside of what was clearly the window of a very fine house? And why here? Why not one of the horrific prison camps? Why not a field hospital? Had they anticipated capturing her alive? More than once the Coyote had chased her quite close to the ground during a dance. Maybe that's what he did, literally ran gliders to ground. Maybe that was his plan all along. Maybe he had always wanted to keep her. But what if I hadn't survived, she thought. Al didn't. The renewed thought of Al brought a sob from between her lips before she could fully clamp down on the sound. Robin jammed her fist against her mouth and waited, but there was no indication out in the hallway that she'd been heard. Hobbling back to the bed, she sat in the center of it. She used one of the ridiculously luxuriant pillows to cradle her ankle and lifted her palms upwards. Warmth and wetness prickled her eyes, built a hot lump in her throat, and she swallowed hastily, blinking rapidly, and then gave in. She wept. Her heart ached so fiercely she feared a god had wrapped his hand around it and was squeezing her to death. Her back burned with long, shuddering sobs, and her nose and eyes stung. When she felt she couldn't possibly cry anymore, that she'd used up her lifetime's allotment of tears, she raised her palms and began the prayers that would, she hoped, guide Al's wandering spirit back to Saskwya, where it could be reborn again as a Seelie, innocent and safe. She knew the Klonn hadn't buried him with the proper rites, and she was damned if she was going to let Al wander the woods of Klonn for the rest of time, alone and unloved, if her own people didn't find his body. Finally, she forced herself to stop. She would not cry any longer, not until she knew where she was, and if it was safe enough to show that kind of weakness. She had grieved Alistair Bridget, and would indulge in her sadness only when she was once again safe and in the comfort and quiet of her own home. Now, she had to focus. Now, she had to escape. She raised her hands and began the prayers to the gods of luck, the gods of young men, the gods of travel, anyone she thought might help. Her lips tingled with the sting of her misery, and she did her very best to forget what it had felt like to kiss a kind friend she would never see again.
Give up when you're down. Fly as long as you can.